I hear cars, multiple cars. Who is that? Oh no, it can't be.
Mama, what are you doing here? Don't you think I should ask you the same question? Welcome, I've arranged everything. What is this? We shouldn't be here. Please, Mama, just hear me out. I had to. They needed a place. How could you? This is our home.
The first thing I noticed was the luggage. 3 SUVs rolled into the driveway of my beach cottage while my bridge club was setting dinner on the table. My daughter Grace stepped out first, followed by her husband, his parents, and enough relatives to fill every bedroom. Barbara Bennett climbed the porch steps smiling like she owned the place. Grace told us you gave us the cottage for 3 weeks. I looked at my daughter. Her face went pale. I never gave anyone this cottage, I said. Grace hurried toward me and lowered her voice. Mom, please, don't embarrass me in front of them. That was when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. My daughter had promised away something that had never belonged to her. Before I tell you how we ended up standing on that porch, I'd love to know what you would have done in my place. Would you let them stay to keep the peace? Or would you tell everyone to leave? Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. If stories about family betrayal, boundaries, and second chances speak to you, please like the video and subscribe. I have a feeling you'll understand why what happened next changed my relationship with my daughter forever. Nah. She gave a short laugh, but it sounded forced. That's not what I meant. I know. She hesitated. What happens to the cottage someday? That question stayed in the room longer than it should have. I put down my fork. Someday. You know what I mean. Actually, I did. She meant when I died. I wasn't offended. Families need to discuss those things eventually. But there was something in her expression I couldn't quite place. Not grief, not curiosity. Calculation might be too harsh a word. Expectation was closer. My will is in order, I said. You don't need to worry. I'm not worried. Then why are you asking? She shrugged. No reason. I let it go. That was my mistake. A week later, Barbara happened to call while Grace was visiting me. Grace was standing near the kitchen counter, and I could hear Barbara's voice through the phone, cheerful and loud. They talked about summer plans. Then Barbara said something I didn't understand at the time. Well, at least your side of the family has that wonderful beach place. Grace glanced at me. For the briefest second, something changed in her face. Then she walked into the hallway and lowered her voice. I didn't follow her. I didn't ask what Barbara meant. I certainly didn't imagine that my little cottage, the one Thomas and I had saved for year after year, had already begun becoming something else in my daughter's conversations. Something bigger, something grander, something that made Grace feel more important in the Bennett family. And I had no idea that before long she would make them a promise using my name. Looking back, I think Grace's mistake began long before she actually made the promise. It began with the feeling that she had something to prove. I didn't know the details at the time. Most of what happened that evening came out later after there was no longer any reason for Grace or Michael to hide it from me. The Bennett family had been planning their summer reunion for months. Barbara loved family gatherings, although I sometimes suspected she loved organizing them more than attending them. Every dinner needed a theme. Every Christmas photograph needed coordinated clothing. Every vacation needed enough pictures online to prove everyone had enjoyed themselves. That summer, Barbara wanted something special. The Bennett family hadn't all been together in years. Michael's sister was coming from Ohio with her husband and 2 children. Charles's younger brother and his wife planned to drive down from Maryland. 2 cousins were bringing their families. Barbara had found a large rental house near the North Carolina coast. It had enough bedrooms for everyone, a swimming pool, a large deck, and one of those enormous kitchens designed for people who wanted to cook, while 14 relatives offered opinions. Then less than 2 months before the reunion, the reservation fell through. There was some problem with the property. Grace later told me the owner had canceled after storm damage required repairs. Whatever the reason, Barbara was furious. The family gathered for dinner at Barbara and Charles's house that weekend, and the canceled vacation became the main topic of conversation. "There's nothing comparable left," Barbara complained. She had apparently spent half the afternoon searching rental websites. "Everything decent is booked." Charles suggested they postpone until September. Barbara rejected that immediately. "The children will be back in school." Michael suggested splitting the family between two smaller rentals. Barbara didn't like that either. "The entire point is for everyone to be together." Grace sat at the table listening. She could have remained silent. She should have remained silent. But then Barbara began talking about some friends from her country club. "The Whitmans never have this problem," she said. "They have that house in Hilton Head. When you own a second home, family vacations are so much simpler." It was an ordinary Barbara comment. Maybe she didn't even intend it as an insult. But Grace heard something underneath it. "People like us own vacation homes. People like you rent them." That was how Grace later explained it to me. And instead of letting the comment pass, my daughter said 6 words that changed everything. "My mother has a beach cottage." Barbara looked at her. "Odessa." Grace nodded. "At the Outer Banks." "I didn't realize that." There was surprise in Barbara's voice, and Grace noticed it. That tiny moment mattered. For once, Barbara was impressed by something connected to Grace's side of the family. "What part?" Charles asked. "Near Nag's Head." "How large is it?" Barbara asked. Grace described the cottage. 3 bedrooms plus the small converted room upstairs. A porch. Easy access to the beach. Not luxurious, but comfortable. "It might be tight," Michael said. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, Grace kept going. "There are hotels nearby. Some people could stay at the cottage and everyone could gather there during the day." Barbara's expression brightened. "Would Odessa let us use it?" There it was. The moment when Grace still had an easy way out. She could have said, "I'll ask her." She could have called me from the dinner table. She could have told Barbara she wasn't sure. Instead, Grace smiled. "I'm sure Mom won't mind." Michael looked at her. He knew. That part hurt almost as much as Grace's promise when I learned about it later. He knew I had not been asked. He knew the cottage belonged to me. And he said nothing. Barbara immediately began reorganizing the reunion around my home. "That could actually be better," she said. She started discussing dates. Grace's stomach tightened. She later admitted that was the moment she realized Barbara hadn't interpreted her words as a possibility. Barbara had heard permission. Still, Grace didn't correct her. Charles asked, "Is Odessa going to be there?" "I don't think so," Grace said. Another assumption. Another piece of my life handed away without asking me. By dessert, Barbara was already texting relatives. Grace saw messages arriving. "Outer Banks is back on. Grace's mother has a place. 3 weeks by the beach." Michael finally spoke to Grace when they were driving home. "You need to call your mom." "I know. Tonight." I said I know, but she didn't call. The next morning she planned to. Then Barbara sent a group message thanking Grace for saving the Bennett reunion. Michael's sister replied with 3 photographs of beach umbrellas she wanted to order. One cousin asked whether there was room for a portable crib. Charles offered to bring a grill. Every message made Grace's original mistake harder to correct. She could have ended it with one sentence. "I haven't asked Mom yet." Instead, she began telling herself a story. "Mom always lets me use the cottage. Mom doesn't have plans that week. Mom likes Michael's parents. Mom will understand. Mom won't make me look foolish." That last one was probably the most important. Grace had spent much of her marriage trying to earn Barbara's approval. I wish I had understood how deeply that insecurity had grown. When Grace was young, she had never seemed ashamed of our life. We weren't rich, but she had a stable home. Thomas attended every school play he could. I made birthday cakes that leaned slightly to one side, and Halloween costumes that looked much better from 10 feet away. We saved for her college education. We helped with her wedding. Grace never lacked love, but adulthood introduced her to a different kind of comparison. Michael grew up with things Grace hadn't: country club memberships, expensive vacations, a father who bought him his first car without needing a loan. Barbara could mention a restaurant in Manhattan as casually as I mentioned the diner down the street. Grace began measuring herself against that world. And somewhere along the way, my cottage became useful to her in a way Thomas and I had never intended. It became proof. Proof that her family had something valuable. Proof that she wasn't the daughter of two ordinary working people. Proof that she belonged. The cruel irony was that I had never thought there was anything shameful about being ordinary. Thomas certainly hadn't. He used to say, if a man needs his possessions to introduce him, he probably doesn't have much else to say. Grace had heard him say that dozens of times. But Thomas wasn't there anymore. And I wasn't sitting at Barbara's dinner table that night. The next day became the next week. Grace still didn't call. Michael reminded her twice. According to Grace, he wasn't especially worried. Your mom always says yes to you, he told her. That sentence told me later how both of them had begun to see me. Not as the owner of the cottage. Not as a woman with plans of her own. As Mom. And Mom said yes. Meanwhile, Barbara moved forward. She created meal schedules. She assigned bedrooms. She told relatives which airport was closest. She started talking about a large family photograph on the beach. Then she called Grace one afternoon. I was thinking, Barbara said, if we're going to be there 3 weeks, perhaps you and Michael should go down early and make sure everything is ready. Grace nearly confessed then. Instead, she said, we'll see. By that point, she wasn't simply avoiding an uncomfortable conversation. She was maintaining a lie. And lies have a strange appetite. They need new words to protect the old ones. When someone asked whether towels were provided, Grace said yes. When Barbara asked about parking, Grace explained the driveway. When Michael's sister asked if the children could use the upstairs room, Grace described it. Every answer made Grace sound more like the owner. And every day she waited made telling me the truth more frightening. One night, Michael finally said, Grace, this is getting ridiculous. Call Odessa. Grace stood in their kitchen holding her phone. What if she says no? Michael stared at her. Why would she? Grace didn't answer. Because somewhere inside she understood something Michael didn't. My generosity had always been voluntary. And voluntary kindness carries one uncomfortable truth for people who begin depending on it. The person giving can still say no. Grace looked at my number on her phone. She could have pressed call. Instead, she locked the screen and set the phone on the counter. I'll talk to her later. Michael sighed. We'll work it out. And that became their plan. Not to ask me, not to correct Barbara, not to tell the family that the cottage wasn't theirs, just to work it out later. What Grace couldn't possibly have known was that while the Bennett family was planning 3 weeks inside my cottage, I was sitting around a bridge table with 4 women who had plans of their own. And unlike Grace, they were about to ask me first. My bridge club started because Helen Carter refused to let me become a widow who spent every Tuesday evening talking to her television. That was exactly how she put it. About 6 months after Thomas died, Helen appeared at my front door, carrying a casserole in one hand and a deck of cards in the other. You've had enough sympathy food, she announced. Now you need people. I almost sent her home. Instead, I followed her to a weekly bridge game at a community center in Richmond. That was where I became close to Nancy Brooks, Judith Palmer, and Rebecca Hayes. The 5 of us were different enough that we probably wouldn't have become friends when we were younger. Nancy was 66 and could make a joke out of almost anything. Judith at 71 was quieter and had the unnerving ability to know when someone was lying before the rest of us did. Helen was the organizer, the woman who remembered birthdays, appointments, and exactly who owed whom $6 from lunch. Rebecca was 64 and had rebuilt her life more dramatically than any of us. And then there was me, Odessa Franklin, 68 years old. Learning that retirement and widowhood were not the same thing as disappearing. Bridge was supposedly what brought us together. Eventually, the cards became almost incidental. We talked about children marriages, menopause, grandchildren, money, loneliness, aging parents, doctors' books, and the strange experience of becoming invisible to people who assumed women our age no longer had interesting plans. One Tuesday afternoon, Nancy threw down her cards and said, "We need a vacation." Helen stared. "We're retired. What exactly are we vacationing from other retired people?" I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my iced tea. Nancy leaned forward. "I'm serious. 3 weeks, somewhere near the water. No husbands, no adult children asking for favors, no grandchildren dropping off dogs. Judith raised one eyebrow. 3 weeks. Why not? That question stayed with me. Why not? When I was younger, 3 weeks away would have sounded impossible. There was always work, schools, Thomas's schedule, Grace's activities, something. But now my calendar belonged mostly to me. I have a place, I said. Everyone looked at me. Helen smiled immediately. The cottage. I nodded. I'd taken Helen there before, but Nancy, Judith, and Rebecca had only seen photographs. We could use it. Nancy put both hands on the table. Outer Banks, near Nag's Head. I'm packing tonight. You don't even know when we're going. I'll pack slowly. We laughed. Then Helen became practical. If we're staying 3 weeks, we're paying you. No. Odessa. Absolutely not. It costs money to maintain a house. You're my friends. Exactly. Which is why we're not freeloading for 3 weeks. The others agreed. I resisted for several days. Money between friends can complicate things, and I didn't want anyone feeling like a customer in Thomas's cottage. Then Rebecca suggested something that changed my mind. Take the money and do something with it. Like what? Something Thomas would have liked. I looked at her. Rebecca understood the expression on my face before I said anything. She had lost her first husband to cancer years earlier, although she had since remarried. She understood how easily the dead remained part of everyday decisions. What would he have liked? She asked. I thought about it. Thomas wasn't a man who cared about having his name on buildings. He cared about usefulness. Fix the broken hinge. Drive someone to an appointment. Help a neighbor replace a water heater. If you had something another person needed, you shared it. I don't know, I admitted. Rebecca took a sip of coffee. What about education? That surprised me. Then she told us a story I had heard pieces of before but never in full. Rebecca had been 53 when her first marriage ended. For most of her adult life, she had worked part-time jobs while raising children. When the marriage ended, she discovered that affection didn't pay health insurance premiums, and 20 years of unpaid caregiving didn't fit neatly onto a resume. I thought I was finished, she said. The humor had disappeared from her voice. I remember sitting in my car outside a community college and being too embarrassed to go inside. Nancy frowned. Why embarrassed? Because everyone walking through those doors looked 20. Rebecca finally went in. She enrolled in an accounting certificate program. She was older than some instructors. She studied at her kitchen table at midnight because she hadn't written an exam in decades, and she finished. That certificate led to a bookkeeping job, which led to financial independence. It wasn't the classes that saved me, she said. It was realizing I was still allowed to begin something. None of us spoke for a moment. I thought about women I'd known over the years. Women who spent decades raising children. Women who cared for sick husbands. Women who left difficult marriages at 60. Women who suddenly became widows and discovered their financial lives had always been handled by someone else. The world loves stories about young people beginning their lives. We hear fewer stories about women beginning again. What if the cottage money helped someone do that? I asked. Rebecca smiled. Now you're thinking. The idea grew quickly. We weren't talking about creating some enormous foundation. I didn't have that kind of money, but I could start small. I contacted the community college near my home and asked about helping an older student with tuition, books, certification fees, or supplies. The woman I spoke with told me there were more returning adult students than most people realized. Some were in their 50s, some were in their 60s, a few were older. That conversation stayed with me all afternoon. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt the excitement of building something new instead of preserving something old. The next Tuesday, I told the bridge club, "We'll do it." Nancy blinked. Do what? You'll rent the cottage. Helen smiled. And the money? We'll use it to start a small scholarship fund for women over 50 returning to school or job training. Rebecca reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Thomas would have understood. I was certain of that. Once I agreed to accept payment, I decided we should do everything properly. Maybe that was the office manager in me. I drew up a simple rental agreement with the dates, amount, house rules, and emergency contact information. Helen laughed when she saw it. Odessa, we've known each other for years. Then signing your name shouldn't frighten you. It doesn't. Good. All four women signed. They transferred the money. I deposited it into a separate account earmarked for the scholarship project. We chose 3 weeks in summer. The cottage would be ours. We planned mornings on the beach, afternoons reading on the porch, seafood dinners, ridiculous amounts of bridge, and absolutely no obligation to entertain anyone. I wrote the dates on the calendar hanging beside my refrigerator. 3 full weeks, reserved, committed, spoken for. One afternoon, Grace called while I was reviewing the cottage agreement. "Doing anything interesting?" she asked. "Just paperwork." I almost told her about the bridge trip. I almost told her about the scholarship idea. But the conversation shifted. Grace was distracted. Michael needed something, and within minutes she said she had to go. "Love you, Mom." "Love you too." I hung up and returned to my paperwork. At the time, there seemed to be no reason Grace needed to know my summer schedule immediately. She hadn't asked to use the cottage. As far as I knew, she had no plans involving it. That evening, I placed the signed rental agreement in a folder. Then I looked at Thomas's photograph on the bookshelf. He was standing on the cottage porch in an old Virginia Tech t-shirt holding a paintbrush and smiling as though he'd personally constructed the Atlantic Ocean. "I think you'd like this," I whispered. The house that had once helped raise our daughter was going to help another woman begin again. I felt proud, I felt peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely excited about summer. What I didn't know was that in another house across Richmond, Barbara Bennett had already marked those exact same 3 weeks on her own calendar. She had written 2 words beside them: family reunion. And between Barbara's calendar and mine stood my daughter, who still hadn't told either of us the truth. 2 weeks before our bridge trip, Grace showed up at my house on a Thursday afternoon without calling first. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way she stood on my porch. She had her purse tucked under one arm, sunglasses pushed onto her head, and a tight smile that disappeared the moment I opened the door. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Of course." That answer came too quickly. I let her inside. I had been sorting clothes for the beach, and an open suitcase was sitting on the guest room bed. Grace noticed it as she followed me toward the kitchen. Going somewhere. The cottage. Her steps slowed. When, in a couple of weeks, I opened the refrigerator. "I made iced tea this morning. Want some?" Grace didn't answer immediately. When I turned around, she was still standing beside the kitchen table. "How long are you going for?" "3 weeks. Her face changed. It was subtle, but mothers learn to read their children's faces long before those children learn to lie with them. I closed the refrigerator. "Grace, 3 weeks. Yes. You're staying there the whole time. That's the plan." She pulled out a chair and sat down. I poured 2 glasses of tea. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "You've said that twice now, which usually means something is definitely wrong." She gave me a strained smile. "I was just wondering about the cottage." "What about it? Is it available this summer?" I stared at her. "Available for what?" She lifted one shoulder. "I don't know. I was just asking." I sat across from her. "You drove 20 minutes to ask whether my cottage is available." I was in the neighborhood. Grace lived almost 40 minutes away. She wasn't in the neighborhood, but I didn't challenge her. "The cottage is spoken for," I said. "For the entire summer." "No, for those 3 weeks." "By who?" "My bridge club." Grace blinked. "Your bridge club?" "Helen, Nancy, Judith, Rebecca, and me." "But you said you're going." "I am." "You said the cottage was spoken for." "It is. They rented it." That was when the panic finally appeared. "Rented it?" "Yes." "You charged your friends." "They insisted on paying." "Why?" I smiled. "That's actually something I've been meaning to tell you." I explained the basic idea, not every detail but enough. I told her Rebecca had inspired us to use the rental money to help an older woman return to school or complete career training. I told her I'd contacted the community college and was looking into the best way to structure the assistance. I expected Grace to be pleased. Instead, she stared at me as though I'd just announced I'd sold the cottage. Mom, you can't. I stopped smiling. Can't what? Rent it to them. I already did. Then give them their money back. For several seconds, I genuinely thought I'd misunderstood her. Excuse me. You said they're your friends. They'll understand. Understand what? Grace pushed her chair back slightly. That something came up. Nothing came up. Mom. There was something in her voice I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. Impatience. Not disagreement. Impatience that I wasn't immediately doing what she wanted. I folded my hands on the table. Grace, why do you care whether Helen and the others use the cottage? She looked toward the window. I might need it. Might. I was hoping to use it around then. You never asked. I know. Then why are you telling me to cancel plans I've already made? She rubbed her forehead. Because my plans are more complicated. I felt my patience thinning. More complicated doesn't mean more important. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Grace stood and walked toward the counter. She picked up her glass but didn't drink from it. The Bennetts are planning a family reunion. I waited. And? She looked at me. They're counting on the cottage. For a moment, the kitchen seemed unusually quiet. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, a lawnmower somewhere down the street, the clock above my stove. Counting on it, how? Grace swallowed. They need somewhere to stay. Why? The rental Barbara booked was canceled. I'm sorry to hear that. Everything else is booked or ridiculously expensive. That's unfortunate. Grace stared at me as if I were deliberately refusing to understand something obvious. Mom, they need the cottage. No, Grace, they want the cottage. What's the difference? The difference is nobody needs a beach vacation. Her mouth tightened. You know what I mean. I don't think I do. She sat down again. Barbara has been organizing this for months. Michael's sister is coming. His uncle is coming. There are cousins, children, everybody. How many people? Does that matter? Considering we're discussing my house, yes. She sighed. Some would stay there. Others would get hotel rooms nearby. My uneasiness sharpened. How do they know about the cottage? Grace looked down. They've known about it for years. That's not what I asked. She didn't answer. Something cold settled in my stomach. Grace. What? Why are the Bennetts counting on a house I never offered them? Her eyes filled with frustration. I told them it might be available. Might. It was such a useful little word, soft enough to hide behind. Did you tell them you had asked me no? Did you tell them I had agreed? I didn't exactly say that. What exactly did you say? She looked away. I said you probably wouldn't mind. There it was. Not the whole truth, though I didn't know that yet. I leaned back. You spoke for me. I made an assumption. About my property. You're making it sound worse than it is. I'm repeating what happened. Grace's voice rose. They've already planned everything. Then they'll need to change their plans. Her expression hardened. You're serious. Completely. What am I supposed to tell Barbara? The truth. Grace laughed once without humor. That's easy for you to say. Actually, it should be easy for you to say. It's your truth. You don't understand what she's like. I understand Barbara perfectly well. No, you don't, Grace began pacing. She already thinks my family is different. Different from what, them. And what's wrong with that? Nothing, Mom. That's not the point. It sounds very much like the point. She stopped. For a moment, I saw something beneath the anger. Fear. That softened me, but only slightly. Grace, I said, if you told Barbara something before asking me, I understand why you're embarrassed. But embarrassing yourself doesn't give you the right to break my commitment to 4 other people. They're your bridge friends. Yes. These are my in-laws. And... She stared at me. I couldn't believe the question needed an answer. One group isn't automatically more deserving because they're related to your husband. They've planned around this. So have we. Your friends can find another place. So can the Bennetts. Grace's jaw tightened. They'll lose money. My friends have paid me already. I'll pay them back. No. Michael and I will pay them back. No. Then let us pay for another rental for them. No. Grace slapped her palm lightly against the table. Why are you being so stubborn? I felt something inside me become very still. Because I gave my word. It's 3 weeks at a beach house. Exactly. So why should my friend's 3 weeks matter less than Barbara's? She had no answer. I continued. Rebecca rearranged appointments. Judith has family commitments before and after the trip. Nancy already bought her train ticket because she doesn't want to drive. Helen helped me organize everything. They signed an agreement. Grace frowned. You made them sign a contract? A simple rental agreement. Her face lost another shade of color. You're kidding. No. Mom, they're friends. And friends deserve clarity too. She whispered something under her breath. What? Nothing. I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table and realized there was still something she wasn't telling me. How could they be counting on something I never offered them? This time I didn't let her escape the question. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she picked up her purse. I shouldn't have come. That's not an answer. I'll figure something out. Figure out what? She headed toward the door. Grace. She turned around. Her eyes were wet now, but she was angry enough not to cry. Just tell them yes, Mom. Who? The Bennetts. No. One word. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't apologize for it. Grace stared at me as if she'd never heard me say it before. Maybe she hadn't heard it often enough. Then she left. I stood at the window and watched her car disappear down the street. For the rest of that evening, I kept replaying the conversation. Something didn't fit. If Grace had merely told Barbara the cottage might be available, why was she so frightened? Why couldn't she simply say she'd been mistaken? Why was an entire family already counting on my house? The answer arrived 4 days later. Not from Grace, not from Michael, from Barbara Bennett herself. Or more precisely from a photograph Barbara posted online. A photograph of my cottage. 4 days after Grace walked out of my kitchen, I was sitting at my dining room table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, making a list of groceries to take to the cottage. I had almost convinced myself that the situation was over. Grace would tell Barbara she'd made a mistake. The Bennetts would find another place to stay. There might be hurt feelings for a few days, perhaps, an uncomfortable Thanksgiving later that year, but families survived worse things. Then I opened Facebook. I wasn't much of a social media person. Helen had convinced me to create an account years earlier mostly so I could see photographs of friends' grandchildren without asking them to email everything. Barbara, on the other hand, treated Facebook like a personal newspaper. That morning, her newest post was at the top of my screen. The photograph stopped me before the words did. It was my cottage. Not a similar cottage. Mine. The pale blue siding. The white porch railing Thomas had repaired twice. The hydrangeas I'd planted. Even the little wooden sign beside the door that read Franklin Cottage. I stared at the photograph. Then I read Barbara's caption. Counting down to 3 glorious weeks with the entire Bennett family at our family's private Outer Banks cottage. Nothing matters more than making memories together. A special thank you to our wonderful Grace for making it possible. Our family's private cottage. I read those words again, then again. My first reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief. Maybe Barbara had misunderstood. Maybe Grace had sent her a photograph while explaining the situation, and Barbara had posted too soon. Then I saw the comments. Michael's sister had written, "The kids haven't stopped talking about it." A cousin wrote, "Best reunion location yet." Another relative asked whether the upstairs room still had twin beds. Still had. That word caught my attention. Someone had already been told details about the house. Barbara replied, "Grace says there's plenty of room and will organize overflow accommodations nearby." I stopped breathing for a second. Grace says. I scrolled farther. Someone asked about beach access. Barbara replied that it was an easy walk. Someone asked whether they should bring linens. Barbara answered, "Grace has everything handled." I set my coffee down because my hand had begun shaking. This wasn't a casual misunderstanding. My daughter had been planning other people's stay in my home. She had described bedrooms, parking, beach access. She had apparently discussed linens, and she had done all of it without once asking me. The cottage wasn't just a piece of property. Thomas's old fishing hat still hung on a hook in the mudroom because I couldn't bring myself to move it. Our initials were carved beneath one porch rail where nobody else could see them. In the upstairs closet was a box of Grace's childhood beach toys I had never thrown away, and now people I barely knew were discussing where they would sleep as if they had made a hotel reservation. I called Grace. She didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. On the third attempt, she picked up. "Mom, I'm at work." Then "Step somewhere private." Silence. What happened? "I saw Barbara's post." Another silence. This one told me everything before Grace said a word. "Mom, did you see it?" "Yes." "Did you tell Barbara to remove it?" "No." "Why not?" "Because that would create more questions." I almost laughed. Grace questions are exactly what you should have allowed months ago. I was going to fix it. When I'm working on it. "How?" She sighed. "Can we please not do this while I'm at work?" "No. You came to my house 4 days ago and told me you'd only said the cottage might be available." I said something like that. "No, Grace. You deliberately gave me the smallest piece of the truth you thought I would accept. That's not fair. Barbara has announced to the entire family that she's spending 3 weeks at my cottage." "I know. People are discussing bedrooms." "I know." "How? What do you mean? How do they know the bedrooms, Grace?" She didn't answer. "Did you send them pictures?" "I sent Barbara some." My chest tightened. "When?" "A while ago. Before you spoke to me." "Yes." There it was. I closed my eyes. "Tell me exactly what you promised." "I didn't promise anything exactly." "Stop." My voice wasn't loud. That made Grace quiet. "Stop choosing words that make this sound smaller. Tell me what happened." I heard her breathing. Finally, she said, "Barbara's original rental was canceled." "I know that part. They couldn't find anything else. And I told them you had the cottage. You told me that too." "I said we'd probably be able to use it." Probably another pause. "At first. And later. Mom, everybody got excited." "That isn't an answer." "I told them it would be fine." My fingers tightened around the phone. "You told them they could stay there." "Yes." "Without asking me." "I thought you'd say yes." "Why?" "Because you always let me use it." "You are my daughter. That doesn't make you the owner." "I know that." "Do you?" Grace's voice cracked. "I made a mistake." For the first time, I heard tears. The anger in me softened for half a second. Grace was still my child. She could be 39, married, successful, standing in an office somewhere, and part of me would always remember the little girl who crawled into my bed during thunderstorms. But love doesn't erase consequences. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "You already know." "No, I want you to say it." She began crying quietly. "I need you to let them have the cottage." "For 3 weeks." "Yes." "And what happens to Helen, Nancy, Judith, and Rebecca?" "We'll find them somewhere else." "We, Michael and I." "They don't want somewhere else." "Mom, please." "No." "Barbara has told everyone." "Then Barbara needs to be told the truth." "Do you know how humiliating that will be?" "For whom?" "For me." The force of her answer startled me. There it was. Not the reunion, not the children who wanted a beach vacation, not even Barbara. Grace was terrified of looking foolish. "I understand that you're embarrassed," I said. "You don't understand at all." "Then explain it." "Barbara already thinks I don't measure up." "Has she said that?" "She doesn't have to." I stood and walked toward the window. "Grace, if you need to lie about what you own to earn someone's respect, that isn't respect." "I didn't lie about owning it." "She called it your family's private cottage." "It is in my family. It is in your mother's name." "You're splitting hairs." I turned away from the window. "No, I'm describing ownership." She began crying harder. "Please, Mom, just this once. Help me." Those words hurt because I had helped Grace hundreds of times. When she needed tuition money, Thomas and I helped. When she needed someone to stay with her after surgery, I slept on her couch. When she and Michael moved, I packed boxes. When she called me heartbroken or frightened, I answered. And now helping her meant betraying 4 women who had done absolutely nothing wrong. I can help you tell the truth, I said. That's not helping. It's the only help I'm offering. She became quiet. Then she said something I will never forget. You're making this harder than it has to be. I felt as if something inside me had cracked. I'm making it harder. You could solve this with one phone call. So could you. That's different. No, Grace, it isn't. I sat down again. You made a promise using something that belongs to me. Now you're asking me to break my promise so you don't have to admit yours was never yours to make. Mom. No. That word again. This time I understood why it felt so unfamiliar between us. I had spent decades making Grace's life easier. Maybe somewhere along the way I had taught her that my inconvenience was an acceptable price for her comfort. Grace sniffed. So that's it. Yes. You're choosing your bridge club over your daughter. I'm choosing not to punish innocent people for a decision they didn't make. Barbara will never let me forget this. Then perhaps Barbara isn't the person whose approval you should be chasing. Grace hung up. I sat at the table for several minutes staring at Barbara's photograph of my cottage. Then I noticed something else. The post had been shared. More Bennett relatives were seeing it. More plans were being made. I wanted to call Barbara myself. I wanted to write beneath her photograph, "This house is mine and none of you have permission to stay there." But I didn't. Grace had created the lie. Grace needed to correct it. That evening Helen called. "You sound tired," she said. "Family trouble. Want to talk?" "Not yet." Helen knew me well enough not to push. Before hanging up, she said, "Whatever it is, Odessa, don't solve somebody else's mistake by making yourself pay for it." I wrote that sentence on the legal pad beside my grocery list. The next morning, Barbara's post was still online. The day after that, too. Grace didn't call. She didn't correct it. She didn't tell the Bennetts the cottage wasn't available. Instead, 2 evenings later, someone knocked on my front door. When I opened it, Michael was standing there alone. He gave me the polite smile he always used when he wanted a conversation to remain civilized. "Odessa," he said, "I think you and I need to work something out." And from the way he said it, I already knew he hadn't come to apologize. He had come to negotiate. Michael had always been good at making uncomfortable conversations sound like business meetings. That evening was no exception. He stood on my porch wearing pressed khakis and a pale blue shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. He wasn't carrying flowers. He wasn't carrying an apology. I was carrying a leather portfolio. That should have told me everything. "Come in," I said. "Thanks, Odessa." I led him into the living room. "Coffee?" "No, thank you." "Tea?" "I'm fine." Michael sat on the sofa and placed the portfolio beside him. I took the armchair opposite him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he leaned forward. "I know things have gotten a little complicated." Complicated isn't the word I'd use. He nodded as though I had made a reasonable point during a negotiation. "Grace is upset. So am I." "I know." "Does she?" His eyes dropped briefly. "She knows she should have talked to you sooner." "Sooner?" I almost smiled. "Michael, she should have talked to me before promising my house to anyone." "You're right." The quick agreement surprised me. Then he continued. "But we're where we are now." There it was. A phrase designed to skip over responsibility and move directly to solving the inconvenience. "And where exactly are we?" I asked. "The family reunion is less than 2 weeks away. People have requested time off. Some relatives are traveling from out of state. Barbara has organized meals and activities. There are children involved." "Children. My sister's kids. Some cousins. And what would you like me to do about that?" Michael exhaled. "I'd like to find a solution that works for everyone." I already knew what his definition of everyone meant. "Go ahead." He opened the portfolio. Inside were printed pages. I looked at rentals near Nag's Head. For the Bennetts. For your friends. I stared at him. He slid several sheets across the coffee table. There are still options. I didn't touch them. You're looking for vacation rentals for Helen and the others. Just alternatives. Why? Because relocating 4 people is easier than reorganizing an entire family reunion. 5 people. I'm part of the bridge trip. Right, 5. He said it as if correcting the number solved the insult. I looked at the pages. There were photographs of rental properties' rates, distances from the beach. Michael had clearly spent time on this. Some of these are actually nicer than your cottage, he said. One has a pool. I don't want a pool. Your friends might. They don't. Have you asked me? No, because they rented my cottage. Michael leaned back. Odessa, I'm trying to make this easy. For whom? His expression tightened slightly. For everybody. No, you're trying to make it easy for Grace. She's your daughter. Yes. Then you understand why I'm trying to protect her. Protect her from what? He hesitated. Embarrassment. There was that word again. I picked up one of the rental listings. Who would pay for this? I would. I looked at him. All 3 weeks. Yes. That's several $1,000s. I can handle it. I put the paper down. This isn't about money. Everything has a practical solution. No, Michael. Some things have a moral solution. He frowned. I'm not sure I follow. Grace made a promise she had no right to make. The practical solution is for me to inconvenience 4 innocent women so Grace doesn't have to admit what she did. The moral solution is for Grace to tell the truth. She made a mistake. I agree. People make mistakes. They do. So why turn it into something bigger? I didn't. He rubbed his hands together. Barbara has already told everyone. I've seen the post. Michael looked uncomfortable. That was unfortunate. No. The unfortunate part was your wife telling Barbara the cottage was available. He looked toward the window. I told Grace she should ask you. But when she didn't, you let the planning continue. I assumed you'd agree. There it was again. That assumption. Why? Michael seemed genuinely confused. Because you've always let Grace use the place. Grace using my cottage for a weekend is not the same as Grace giving it to 15 people for 3 weeks. It's family. Your family. Grace's family, too. Yes. And they are welcome to rent somewhere. He leaned forward again. Let's talk about the bridge club. We already did. I'll reimburse everything they've paid. No. Double it. No. I'll cover a hotel too. No. He stared at me. Why? Because they don't want money. They want the vacation we planned. They could have a better vacation. That's not your decision. They're friends, Odessa. Yes. And we're family. I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly. It was recognition. Michael believed the word family ended the argument. As if being related to someone gave you priority over every promise, every boundary, every person outside the bloodline. Do you know what Helen did after Thomas died? I asked. Michael blinked. What? She came to my house almost every day for 2 weeks. I didn't know that. Nancy drove me to a cardiology appointment when I was too frightened to go alone. Judith sat with me the first Christmas Eve I spent without my husband. Rebecca helped me understand that I was still allowed to build a life after 60. Michael said nothing. So when you say they're just my bridge friends, what exactly do you mean? I didn't mean to insult anyone. But you did. He looked genuinely embarrassed. I'm sorry. I nodded. Thank you. For a moment I thought perhaps we had reached each other. Then Michael glanced at the papers again. So there's really nothing I can offer? No. What if we compensate the scholarship fund separately? My eyes narrowed. Grace told you about that? Yes. Then you should understand why the rental matters. I do. I'm saying we could still contribute the same amount. Again, Michael, this isn't about replacing dollars. He sighed. I don't know what you expect Grace to do. Tell Barbara the truth. You know what that will do to their relationship. No, I don't. Barbara can be difficult. Then Grace should stop building her self-worth around Barbara's approval. Michael became quiet. For the first time, he looked less like a real estate professional negotiating terms and more like a tired husband caught between two women. I wish it were that simple. So do I. He stood and walked toward the fireplace. On the mantel was a photograph of Thomas and me at the cottage. Thomas had one arm around my waist. Both of us were sunburned and smiling. Michael picked up the frame. You and Thomas really loved that place. We did. He put the photograph back. Then he said almost casually, I suppose that's why Grace is so attached to it. I looked at him. Grace is attached to it. You know what I mean. I'm not sure I do. He turned toward me. She's always assumed she'd keep it in the family. The cottage is already in the family. I mean, eventually. That word again. Eventually. I waited. Michael continued, apparently unaware of the hole he was digging. Eventually, the cottage will probably be Grace's anyway. The room went silent. Michael realized it a second too late. I stood. Probably. I didn't mean anything by that. Then explain what you meant. He put both hands into his pockets. Odessa, come on. Grace is your only child. And, naturally, we've always assumed that someday. He stopped. He looked at me. You and Grace have discussed what happens to my cottage after I die. Not like that. Then like what? It comes up. How often? He didn't answer. Something cold moved through me. Until that moment, I had believed the conflict was about a vacation. Grace wanted to impress Barbara. She had made a foolish promise. Michael wanted to clean up the mess. But now I understood there was something deeper beneath it. In their minds, my cottage already had a future owner. And it wasn't me. You've been treating the cottage like Grace's property because you assume she'll inherit it. No one is treating it like anything. Your wife promised it to your family. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. I chose my words badly. No, I think you finally chose honest ones. Odessa. I walked toward the mantel and touched the corner of Thomas's photograph. Thomas and I had worked years for that cottage. We had repaired it, paid taxes on it, insured it, loved it. After Thomas died, I had maintained it alone. And somehow, while I was still alive, other people had begun mentally distributing it. I turned back to Michael. Do you know the difference between an inheritance and a possession? Of course. An inheritance belongs to someone after it is given to them. A possession belongs to someone now. I understand. Do you? He didn't respond. I pointed toward the rental listings. Take those. Michael gathered the papers. I'm sorry this conversation went this way. So am I. At the doorway, he stopped. I really wasn't trying to disrespect you. I believe you. That surprised him. Then I added, I think you've been disrespecting me for so long without realizing it that it started feeling normal. His face changed. I opened the door. He stepped onto the porch. Before he left, I said, Michael. He turned. Eventually is not today. He looked down. No. And my being 68 doesn't turn my belongings into waiting room property for the next generation. I understand. I wasn't sure he did. Not yet. After his car disappeared, I returned to the living room. I picked up the photograph of Thomas. For years, I had assumed Grace would probably inherit the cottage too. I had never questioned it. But now, for the first time, I did. Not because I wanted revenge, because something Michael had said exposed a truth I could no longer ignore. Grace and Michael weren't simply thinking about what I might leave behind someday. They had begun living as though part of it already belonged to them. I placed the photograph back on the mantel. Then I looked toward the hallway where my suitcase was waiting. I wasn't canceling my trip. I wasn't moving my friends. And I wasn't surrendering my cottage to rescue Grace from a lie. What I didn't know was that Grace had already decided on one final way to force my hand. If I wouldn't say yes over the phone, she would make sure I had to say no in front of everyone. The morning we left Richmond for the Outer Banks, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Helen rode with me. Nancy took the train part of the way because she hated long highway drives, and Judith and Rebecca followed in Judith's car. I had packed more food than 5 women could reasonably eat 3 novels. I probably wouldn't finish 2 decks of cards and the folder containing our rental agreement. The folder was mostly habit. 30 years as an office manager had taught me that paperwork was most useful precisely when everyone insisted it wasn't necessary. I didn't know how useful it was about to become. Grace hadn't called since Michael's visit. Neither had Michael. Barbara's Facebook post eventually disappeared. I took that as a good sign. Maybe Grace finally told them, Helen said as we crossed into North Carolina. I hope so. You could call her. I could. But I watched the road. She created this situation. I need her to be the one who corrects it. Helen nodded. Fair. By late afternoon, we reached the cottage. The moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt my shoulders relax. The air smelled like salt and warm wood, the hydrangeas were blooming beside the steps, and somewhere beyond the houses I could hear the ocean. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Thomas's fishing hat still hung in the mudroom. Nancy arrived and immediately claimed the room with the best reading chair. Judith complained that Nancy had somehow chosen a bedroom before officially entering the house. Rebecca opened the windows. Helen inspected the refrigerator and announced that I'd packed enough food to survive a hurricane. For the first 2 days, we did almost nothing, and it was wonderful. We walked on the beach early in the morning. We played bridge in the afternoon. Nancy bought a ridiculous straw hat from a souvenir shop and refused to take it off. Rebecca and I spent an hour talking about the scholarship project. I began to believe the family drama had remained in Richmond. On the third afternoon, I called Grace. It went to voicemail. I left a short message. Just checking in. I hope everything worked out. Love you. She didn't call back. That bothered me. But not enough. Not yet. The next day, we spent the morning at the beach. By 5, Judith was making salad while Rebecca seasoned fish in the kitchen. Helen was setting the table. Nancy was opening a bottle of sparkling water and pretending it was champagne. I was cutting lemons when we heard the first vehicle. Tires rolled slowly over the gravel driveway. I glanced toward the window. Expecting somebody? Helen asked. No. A dark SUV stopped outside, then another turned in behind it, then a third. My knife stopped halfway through a lemon. Nancy came beside me. Odessa. I walked to the front window. The driver's door of the first SUV opened. Michael stepped out. My stomach dropped. Grace emerged from the passenger side. Behind them. Barbara climbed out of another vehicle wearing white pants, oversized sunglasses, and the expression of a woman arriving exactly where she expected to be. Charles came around the other side. Then more doors opened. Adults, children, suitcases, coolers, beach chairs, bags of groceries. One man lifted a folded canopy from the back of an SUV. Nancy whispered, "Please tell me these people have the wrong house." I couldn't answer. Helen stood beside me. "Is that Grace?" "Yes." "And Michael?" "Yes." Her face hardened. "Oh, Odessa." I opened the front door. Grace saw me immediately. For 1 second she froze. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't an accidental misunderstanding. She knew I would be here. She knew my friends would be here. And she had brought everyone anyway. Barbara spotted me and smiled. "Odessa." She walked toward the porch. Behind her, one of the children shouted something about choosing a bedroom. I stepped outside. Grace followed Barbara several feet behind. Michael wouldn't meet my eyes. "Barbara," I said. "This is wonderful." Barbara climbed the steps and looked around. Pictures don't do it justice. So charming. Charming. I had never hated that word before. Charles approached carrying a suitcase. "Good to see you, Odessa." "Charles." Barbara looked through the open door and noticed Helen behind me. "Oh." Then Nancy appeared, then Judith, then Rebecca. Barbara's smile faltered. "I didn't realize you had company." "I do." Grace finally reached the porch. "Mom." Her voice was low. I looked directly at her. "What are you doing here?" Barbara laughed lightly. "Apparently the same thing you are, starting our vacation." Nobody laughed with her. I turned back to Grace. "What did you tell them?" Grace's eyes pleaded with me. "Can we talk inside?" "No." "Mom, answer me." Before she could, Barbara stepped between us verbally. I'm confused. Grace said you gave us the cottage for 3 weeks. There it was. The sentence from the beginning of this story. Simple, clear, impossible to soften. I looked at my daughter. Her face went pale. I never gave anyone this cottage, I said. Silence spread across the driveway. Even the children seemed to notice. Barbara turned toward Grace. What does she mean? Grace stepped closer and lowered her voice. Mom, please, don't embarrass me in front of them. For 1 second I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't know what to say, because I finally understood her plan. She hadn't corrected Barbara. She hadn't found another rental. She hadn't admitted the truth. Instead, she had allowed all these people to pack, allowed them to drive hours, allowed children to believe they were beginning their beach vacation. Because Grace believed that once they were standing in my driveway, I wouldn't have the heart to refuse. She had turned my compassion into leverage. Helen came onto the porch. Odessa, do you want us to go inside? No. My voice was steadier than I felt. You stay. Barbara removed her sunglasses. Someone needs to explain what's happening. I agree. She looked at me. Grace told us this was arranged. It wasn't. She said you knew. I didn't. Grace whispered, Mom. I held up my hand. No. Michael finally approached. Odessa, maybe we can talk privately. We've already talked privately. Barbara turned toward him. You knew about this. Michael hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Barbara's face changed. Michael, we thought we could work something out. You told me this was settled. I didn't exactly. Barbara stared at her son, then at Grace. Did either of you actually get Odessa's permission? Grace looked at the ground. Barbara's voice sharpened. Grace. Before she could answer, one of Michael's relatives approached carrying 2 grocery bags. Where should I put these? Nobody answered. The man looked around awkwardly and slowly returned to his vehicle. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Barbara pointed toward the cottage. Well, we're here now. Surely something can be arranged. Grace looked at me with sudden hope. That sentence was exactly what she had been counting on. Surely something can be arranged. Meaning surely Odessa will move. Surely Odessa will sacrifice. Surely Odessa will save everyone from discomfort. I shook my head. The cottage is rented. Barbara frowned. To whom? To us. Helen stepped beside me. Barbara looked at her. Your friends. My bridge club. Barbara seemed genuinely stunned. You're telling me this entire house is being used by 5 women playing cards? Nancy called from the doorway, among other things. I nearly smiled. Barbara didn't. Odessa, with all due respect, we have relatives who drove from several states. I understand. Children. I see them. We have nowhere else arranged. I'm sorry. Then why can't your friends move to a hotel? Helen's expression changed, but I answered before she could. Because they rented this cottage. Barbara looked at me as though I'd spoken another language. They paid you. Yes. For 3 weeks. Yes. Grace interrupted. Mom, we already talked about this. We did. And Michael offered to pay them. He did. So what's the problem? I stared at my daughter. The problem is you still think their agreement disappears because you're uncomfortable. Barbara folded her arms. Is there actually an agreement? That was when 30 years of office work rewarded me. Yes. I walked inside. The folder was in the drawer beside the kitchen counter. When I returned, everyone was still standing in the same places. I opened the folder. This agreement was signed months ago. I handed it to Barbara. She read the first page. Her eyes moved toward the dates, then the signatures. Helen Carter, Nancy Brooks, Judith Palmer, Rebecca Hayes, and mine. Barbara looked at Grace. These dates are exactly the dates you gave us. Grace said nothing. I told you my friends had rented it, I said. Barbara looked confused. When did Grace know I didn't take my eyes off my daughter? 2 weeks ago at the latest. Barbara's face hardened. You knew. Grace finally looked up. I thought Mom would change her mind. You let us come anyway. I thought once everyone was here. She stopped. She didn't need to finish. Once everyone was here, Mom would surrender. Barbara stared at her. For the first time since I'd known her, Barbara Bennett seemed to have absolutely nothing to say. Charles put down the suitcase he'd been carrying. Michael closed his eyes. And Grace stood in the middle of the driveway, while the truth she had spent months avoiding finally became impossible to hide. Barbara held up the rental agreement. Grace, I asked you a simple question before any of us made these plans. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Barbara's voice was quiet now, much quieter than before. Did you actually ask your mother? Grace looked at me, then at Michael, then at the relatives waiting beside their luggage. She couldn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence answered for her. And as painful as that moment was, I still believed my daughter might finally do the right thing. I thought she would apologize. I thought she would turn to the Bennetts and admit the mistake was hers. Instead, Grace wiped her eyes, looked directly at me, and made a choice that hurt more than the original lie. For one foolish second, I thought Grace was going to apologize. Her eyes were wet. Her cheeks had turned red. Around her stood the people she had misled for months, and Barbara was still holding the rental agreement that proved every word I had said. There was nowhere left for Grace to hide. I expected her to say, "I'm sorry." Instead, she looked at me and said, "Mom, can you please just be reasonable?" The words hit me harder than I expected. Reasonable? Grace stepped closer. Yes, everybody's already here. I looked past her. Suitcases sat on the gravel. A little girl was hugging a stuffed dolphin. Someone had stacked grocery bags beside an SUV. One of the older Bennett relatives had already unfolded a beach chair, apparently, because standing had become uncomfortable. I understood exactly what Grace was doing. She wanted me to look at those people and feel guilty. And I did. That was the worst part. I felt terrible for them. They hadn't created the lie. Most of them had simply trusted Grace. But feeling sorry for innocent people did not make my friends responsible for fixing my daughter's deception. Grace, I said, I am being reasonable. No, you're proving a point. Helen shifted beside me. I felt her hand lightly touch my elbow. Grace continued. They drove all this way. Michael's sister came from Ohio. Uncle Peter came from Maryland. There are children here. I can see that. So what are they supposed to do? Find other accommodations. Barbara let out a sharp breath. At this time of year, I turned toward her. I'm sorry you're in this position. You keep saying you're sorry while refusing to help. That stung. But before I could answer, Helen stepped forward. Excuse me. Barbara looked at her. Helen's voice was calm. We aren't refusing to help. We're refusing to surrender something we paid for because someone else promised it twice. Barbara stared at her. This is a family matter. Helen nodded toward me. Odessa is my friend, so I'm trying not to interfere. But the cottage is rented to us. That makes our presence here relevant. Nancy appeared behind Helen. And we didn't drive here by accident either. Judith and Rebecca remained near the doorway watching quietly. Grace looked at them. Nobody is saying you did anything wrong. Then why are we the ones being asked to leave? Rebecca asked. Grace opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Rebecca didn't raise her voice. That's a genuine question. Grace looked at me instead. Mom, I'll find them somewhere nice. They already have somewhere nice. Somewhere nicer. Nancy folded her arms. That's generous, but I like this place. Grace seemed surprised. Nancy continued. I like the porch. I like the walk to the beach. I like that Odessa is here, and I especially like not being relocated because somebody I've never met wants my bedroom. One of the Bennett cousins looked embarrassed and turned away. I almost wished Nancy had softened it. Almost. Barbara handed the rental agreement back to me. I understand they have a contract, but contracts can be canceled. They can, I said. So cancel it. No. Barbara's face hardened. Why? Because I gave them my word. Barbara looked genuinely offended. And Grace is your daughter. Yes. Surely your daughter matters more than a bridge club. There it was again. The same argument Michael had made. Family should win automatically. I took a breath. My daughter matters enormously to me. That's why I'm not going to teach her that lying becomes acceptable if enough people are inconvenienced by the truth. Grace flinched. Don't call me a liar in front of everyone. What would you prefer I call what happened? Mom. You told these people they could use my home. You knew 2 weeks ago that they couldn't. You still let them drive here. Grace wiped her cheek. I thought once you saw everyone you'd understand. I stared at her. Understand what? That sometimes family comes first. The words hurt because they sounded so sincere. Grace truly believed them. Family doesn't come first by taking what belongs to someone else. I wasn't taking it. You brought 15 people to my driveway after I told you no. Barbara looked toward Grace. You knew Odessa had refused. Grace didn't answer. Barbara's eyebrows lifted. Grace, yes. You knew before we left Richmond. Yes. A murmur moved through the group. Michael stepped forward. Mom, let's not do this here. Barbara turned on him. You knew too. Michael's silence answered. Charles finally spoke. Michael, that's not right. It was the first thing he'd said since the confrontation began. Michael rubbed his forehead. I tried to work something out with Odessa. By moving us, Helen said. Michael looked uncomfortable. That was one option. No, I said. That was the only option you came to discuss. Grace shook her head. This is getting out of control. No, I said quietly. It's finally becoming clear. A child began asking when they were going inside. Michael's sister led the children toward the cars. I hated that they were witnessing any of this. I lowered my voice. Grace, take your family somewhere comfortable. Get dinner. Find hotel rooms. Tomorrow when everyone is rested, you can decide what to do next. Grace stared at me. And you're just going to stay here? Yes. Playing cards. That little phrase contained more contempt than she probably realized. Helen's expression hardened, but I answered. Yes, Grace. We are going to play cards. We're also going to walk on the beach, cook meals, read books, talk, laugh, and enjoy the vacation we planned. You know what I mean. I do. You think what we're doing is less important because we're older women with no children to entertain and no husbands waiting for us. I never said that. You didn't need to. Grace's face crumpled. For a moment I wanted to hug her. That instinct surprised me. Even furious, I was still her mother. But before I could move, Barbara spoke. We need to leave. Everyone turned. Barbara looked exhausted now. The polished hostess had disappeared. We'll find hotels. Grace stared at her. Barbara, wait. No. Barbara's voice was clipped. I am not spending another minute standing in a driveway arguing over a house that was never offered to us. It was the first thing she'd said all afternoon that made me respect her. Charles picked up his suitcase. I'll start calling places. Michael pulled out his phone. I'll help. The relatives began returning luggage to the vehicles. The excitement that had filled the driveway 15 minutes earlier was gone. Grace stood perfectly still. She watched Barbara walk away. Then she turned to me. I knew that look. I'd seen versions of it when she was 15 and believed I had ruined her life by refusing to let her attend a party. But this wasn't a teenager standing before me. This was a 39-year-old woman facing the consequences of her own choices. You just humiliated me in front of my entire family. Her voice trembled. I felt every word. Grace. No, don't. She pointed toward the cottage. You could have fixed this. I could have hidden it. What's the difference? The truth. She shook her head. You care more about being right than you care about me. That's not true. It certainly feels true. I stepped closer. I love you. Then why couldn't you do this one thing? Something inside me finally broke open. One thing. My voice rose for the first time. Grace, how many one things have there been? She stared at me. How many times have I rearranged my life because you needed help? How many times did your father and I make room? How many times did I say yes because I loved you? I never asked you to sacrifice everything. No, but you've become so accustomed to my yes that my first serious no feels like betrayal. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. I lowered my voice. You made a promise you had no right to make. You lied when you were afraid to correct it. Then you brought everyone here because you believed embarrassment would force me to surrender. Tears rolled down her face. That's not what I meant. Maybe not, but it's what you did. Behind her, Michael called her name. Grace turned toward him, then back to me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered, I hope your bridge game was worth this. I could have answered angrily. Instead, I said the only thing that felt true. No, Grace, you did. She stared at me. You humiliated yourself. I simply refused to lie for you. Grace flinched as if I'd slapped her. Then she walked away. Michael opened the passenger door for her. Within minutes, the SUVs began leaving the driveway one by one. I stood on the porch until the last taillights disappeared. Only then did I realize my hands were shaking. Helen wrapped an arm around me. You okay? No. That answer felt better than pretending. Inside, dinner had gone cold. Nobody suggested bridge. We reheated the fish and ate quietly. Later, I sat alone on the porch listening to the ocean. I didn't feel victorious. I felt like a mother who had watched her daughter choose pride over honesty. And despite everything, I wondered whether I should have given in. Then my phone buzzed. For one hopeful second, I thought it was Grace. It wasn't. It was Michael. There was no apology, no update about where they were staying, just a short message. We found rooms. We'll discuss the expenses when we get back. I read it twice. The expenses, I had no idea what he meant. 3 days later, I found out. Michael emailed me an invoice for the Bennett family's hotel rooms, and the number at the bottom made me stare at the screen in disbelief. The email arrived on our 6th morning at the cottage. I had gotten up before the others and carried my coffee onto the porch. The sky was pale pink over the rooftops, and I could hear gulls somewhere toward the beach. For the first time since the Bennetts had appeared in my driveway, I felt calm. Then my phone buzzed. Michael Bennett. The subject line read, Accommodation Expenses. I opened it. Michael's message was polite, almost painfully polite. I explained that because the Bennett family had been forced to secure last-minute hotel accommodations during peak season, the costs had been significantly higher than anticipated. Attached was a spreadsheet. Michael had listed the hotel room's parking fees, taxes, and several cancellation charges connected to activities they could no longer use as planned. At the bottom was a total, $11,846.72. I stared at it. Then I read Michael's final paragraph. I believed it would be fair for me to reimburse the family because I had changed the accommodation arrangement after plans had already been made. I actually looked around the porch as though there might be another Odessa Franklin sitting nearby who had changed an arrangement. There wasn't. I read the email again, then a third time. By the time Helen came outside, I was laughing, not because it was funny, because sometimes outrage reaches a point where laughter is safer than throwing your phone into the ocean. Should I be worried? Helen asked. I handed her the phone. She put on her reading glasses. 30 seconds later, she lowered the phone. Oh, absolutely not. That's what I thought. $11,000. And 86 cents. Don't forget the 72. Wouldn't dream of it. Helen sat beside me. Are you going to answer? Yes. What are you going to say? I took my phone back. Something shorter than his spreadsheet. I typed, Michael, I did not make the Bennett family's reservation promise accommodations or change any arrangement. The cottage was never offered to your family. I will not reimburse these expenses. Odessa, I showed Helen. She nodded. Perfect. I sent it. For the next 2 hours, nothing happened. Then Barbara called. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Hello, Barbara. Odessa. Her tone was controlled. Do you have a minute? I do. I understand Michael emailed you. He did. And you refused. I did. There was a pause. I think we should discuss this woman to woman. I nearly asked what Michael and I had been discussing. Instead, I waited. Barbara continued. I'll admit Grace handled this badly. That was more acknowledgement than I'd expected. She did. But this situation has become extremely expensive for everyone. I'm aware. Some relatives couldn't afford the hotel rates. Charles and I are covering part of their costs. I'm sorry. That's what you keep saying. What would you prefer? For you to accept some responsibility? I sat straighter. For what? For refusing to accommodate the family after Grace told everyone the cottage was available. Barbara, listen to your own sentence. What? You said after Grace told everyone. Silence. I didn't tell everyone. Grace did. But it's your cottage. Exactly, Barbara exhaled. You could have prevented all of this by allowing us to stay. And you could prevent every restaurant bill by walking into someone's kitchen and demanding dinner. That's ridiculous. So is charging me because someone else promised you my house. Her voice sharpened. These are your daughter's in-laws. I know who you are. Then I don't understand how you can treat us like strangers. That sentence bothered me. Barbara, I have welcomed you into my home. I've shared holidays with you. Thomas and I attended your anniversary party. I sat beside you at Grace and Michael's wedding. But knowing me does not give you ownership of what belongs to me. I'm not claiming ownership. Your Facebook post called it our family's private cottage. She went silent. I continued. You posted photographs of my home and announced a 3-week vacation before ever hearing from me. Because Grace told me it was arranged. Then your problem is with Grace. She was trying to do something nice for her family. And she used something that wasn't hers to do it. Barbara's tone cooled. You seem determined to punish her. No. That's certainly how it looks. I stood and walked toward the porch railing. The ocean breeze moved through the trees. Would you like to know how Thomas and I bought this cottage? Barbara didn't answer immediately. What does that have to do with anything? Everything, I told her. I told her about Thomas working's overtime, about the vacations we didn't take, about my Christmas bonuses going into savings, about driving an old Buick long after we could have replaced it. I told her about the first summer we owned the cottage when Thomas repaired the porch himself because hiring someone wasn't in our budget. I told her about painting walls after work, about eating sandwiches on buckets because we didn't own patio furniture, about raising Grace there during summer weekends. Then I told her what happened after Thomas died. I couldn't come here for 9 months, I said. Barbara was quiet. Every room reminded me of him. The porch, the kitchen, even the stupid upstairs wallpaper he hated. My voice caught slightly. This cottage isn't a vacation perk, Barbara. It's 30 years of my marriage. It's work, it's grief, it's memory, and it's mine. I understand that. Do you? I lost my sister 3 years ago. I understand grief. That softened me. I remember. I'm sorry. Thank you. For a moment, the fight disappeared. We were simply two older women who knew what it meant to lose people. Then Barbara said, But Grace is your only daughter. And that doesn't make her the owner while I'm alive. I never said it did. No, but apparently she did. Barbara became quiet again. I heard something in the background on her end, perhaps a hotel door closing. Then she said something that changed the entire direction of the conversation. Grace made it sound like it was practically hers. I didn't respond. Barbara continued. That's why none of us questioned it. My fingers tightened around the phone. What do you mean? Odessa, I've heard about that cottage for years. From Grace. Of course. What has she told you? Barbara hesitated. Maybe I shouldn't get involved. You're already involved. She always talked about it as the family beach house. It was the Franklin family beach house. I understand that now. Now, Barbara sighed. She said it would eventually be hers. There was that word again, eventually. Michael had used it too. I felt cold despite the morning heat. When did she say that? I don't know, years ago probably. Years. Odessa. I honestly didn't think anything of it. Parents leave property to their children all the time. That's true. And Grace is your only child. Also true. So when she said we could use the cottage, I assumed she had authority. Because she told you she'd inherit it. Not just that. My stomach tightened. What else? Barbara was silent long enough that I knew the answer mattered. She talked about improvements. What improvements? Renovating the kitchen eventually, maybe adding another bathroom. Michael once mentioned that the property could be worth considerably more with some updates. I gripped the railing. They had discussed renovations to my house without me. Did Grace tell you she was planning those renovations? Not immediately. Someday. Someday. Eventually. Words that sounded harmless until you realized they all depended on one event. My death. I closed my eyes. Barbara, did Grace ever tell you I planned to give her the cottage? Not in those exact words. But she let you believe it. I suppose she did. For the first time, Barbara sounded uncomfortable rather than defensive. Then she said, I thought you knew. Knew what? How she talked about it? No. Then perhaps you and Grace have a larger conversation ahead of you than this vacation. I hated admitting Barbara was right. We ended the call without resolving the hotel bill. But suddenly, $11,000 didn't seem like the most important issue. I returned inside. Rebecca was making coffee. You look pale, she said. I'm fine. She gave me the same look Judith usually did when she knew someone wasn't telling the truth. No, you're not. I sat at the kitchen table. One by one, the others joined me. I told them what Barbara had said. Nobody interrupted. When I finished, Nancy shook her head. She's planning renovations to your house. Apparently someday. Judith leaned back. People reveal a lot by how they talk about someone's belongings when they assume the owner isn't part of the conversation. That sentence stayed with me. I thought about Grace asking whether I planned to sell. I thought about Michael saying the cottage would probably be hers anyway. I thought about Barbara believing Grace practically owned it. The reunion wasn't the beginning. It was simply the first time Grace's private assumptions had collided with my public no. I picked up my phone. I didn't call her. Not yet. I wanted to wait until I could ask questions without shouting. But I knew one thing. When I returned to Richmond, Grace and I were going to sit across from each other. And this time I wasn't going to let her leave until I understood exactly what she had been telling the Bennett family about my cottage. And about the life she apparently believed she had already inherited. Grace came to my house 3 days after I returned to Richmond. I had asked her to come alone. When I heard her car in the driveway, I looked through the front window and felt something I never expected to feel about my own daughter. Nervous. Not afraid of her. Afraid of what I might learn. The cottage dispute had already shown me more than I wanted to know. But Barbara's words had opened another door, and once that door was open, I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what was behind it. Grace rang the bell. I opened the door. Hi, Mom. Come in. She looked tired. There were shadows beneath her eyes, and her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail. For once, she didn't look like she had dressed for Barbara's approval. She looked like my daughter. That almost made the conversation harder. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where weeks earlier she'd asked me to cancel the bridge club's rental. I had made coffee. Neither of us touched it. Grace folded her hands. Michael said you wanted to talk. I do. If this is about the hotel bill, I already told him he shouldn't have sent it. That surprised me. You did? Yes. Why? Because it wasn't your bill. For a second, hope flickered inside me. Thank you. She nodded. Michael was angry. So was I. I know. Silence settled between us. Then I said, this isn't about the hotel. Grace looked wary. What is it about? Barbara called me. Her face changed. While I was at the cottage. What did she say? I'd rather hear it from you. Grace looked down. Mom? I don't know what you're asking. Yes, you do. She didn't answer. I continued. How long have you been telling the Bennetts that the cottage will be yours? Her eyes lifted. There it was. Recognition. I never said it was mine now. That's not what I asked. She leaned back. I've probably said I'd inherit it someday. Probably. I don't remember every conversation I've had in 12 years. Then remember the important ones. Her mouth tightened. I didn't enjoy speaking to her that way, but I had spent too much of my life softening difficult truths so other people could receive them comfortably. Barbara told me you have discussed renovating the cottage. Grace looked toward the window. That wasn't serious. You discussed the kitchen. It was hypothetical. And adding another bathroom. Michael works in real estate. He talks about property all the time. Property he owns, she sighed. Mom. No, don't mom me as though I'm being difficult. I want to understand. Grace rubbed her forehead. What do you want me to say? The truth. She was silent for a long time. Then she said fine. The word came out sharp. I told them I'd probably inherit the cottage. When? I don't know, years ago. Why? Because I probably would. I stared at her. You've never seen my will? No. I've never told you what happens to the cottage. No. Then why did you assume? Her expression shifted from irritation to something more vulnerable. Because I'm your only child. There it was. The logic Michael had used. Not cruel, not even unusual, but dangerous when assumption became entitlement. Grace expecting that you might inherit something someday is one thing. Talking about it as though the decision has already been made is another. I wasn't trying to take anything from you. But you were spending it in conversations. That's ridiculous. Is it? I leaned forward. You talked about renovations. You offered the house to your husband's family. Barbara believed you had authority over it. Michael came here and told me it would probably be yours anyway. None of that happened because of one careless sentence. Grace looked down at her hands. I waited. Finally, she whispered, I wanted them to think we had something. I felt my anger pause. What? She looked up. Her eyes were already wet. The Bennetts. I didn't speak. Grace took a breath. When Michael and I first got married, I never felt like I fit in. Why? You know why? No, tell me. She gave a bitter laugh. Barbara talks about Europe the way we used to talk about going to Myrtle Beach. Michael grew up in a house with a swimming pool. His father gave him a car when he turned 16. And I grew up watching you clip coupons. I felt that sentence in my chest. Grace saw it. I don't mean that badly. It sounded bad. I know. She wiped her eyes. I'm trying to explain. So I let her. When Michael and I were dating, Barbara asked where we vacationed when I was a kid. I told her the Outer Banks. She asked where we stayed. I said we had a cottage. I remembered those summers. Thomas grilling hamburgers. Grace carrying seashells home in plastic buckets. Apparently, somewhere in adulthood, those memories had become social currency. Barbara seemed impressed, Grace continued. It was stupid, but I liked that. So you kept talking about it? Yes. Why not simply say it belonged to your parents? I did at first. At first? She closed her eyes. Later I said it would stay in the family. And eventually that became it would be yours. Grace nodded. I felt more sadness than anger now. Did Barbara ever tell you that you weren't good enough for Michael? No. Did Charles say no? Michael? Of course not. Then who told you? She looked confused. What? Who told you that being my daughter wasn't enough? Her face crumpled. I hadn't intended the question to hurt her, but sometimes the truth finds the bruise before you know where it is. Grace began crying. I don't know. I waited. When I married Michael, everybody seemed so accomplished, she said. They had investments, properties, connections. Barbara knew people everywhere. I always felt like I was the girl who had married up. I almost interrupted. She raised a hand. Please let me finish. So I did. I started exaggerating little things, not exactly lying, just making things sound better. The cottage. The cottage. Dad's job. Your job. Our vacations. My throat tightened. What did you say about your father? That he managed operations. He was a maintenance supervisor. I know. And me worked in insurance management. I managed an office. I know. Every answer felt like a tiny erasure. Thomas and I had worked honest jobs. We had never been ashamed of them. Yet Grace had polished us until we looked acceptable to people whose approval we had never requested. You were ashamed of us. No. The answer came immediately. Then Grace stopped. Her face changed. Maybe I was ashamed of how ordinary we seemed. I sat back. That hurt worse. Grace reached toward me but stopped before touching my hand. I'm sorry. I looked at her. I spent years being proud that your father and I gave you a stable childhood. We worked for everything we had. I know. Do you? Yes. Then why did you turn our life into something that needed improving when you told people about it? She cried silently. I don't know. But I thought she did. She had been trying to earn admission into a world that had never actually asked for an entrance fee. And every exaggeration required another. So when Barbara's rental was canceled, I said, the cottage became your chance to prove the story. Grace nodded slowly. If I could give them the house for the reunion, I thought. What? She looked embarrassed. I thought Barbara would finally see me as someone who contributed something important. You contribute yourself. That doesn't always feel like enough. There was the deepest truth she'd spoken all afternoon. I understood it. I even felt compassion for it. But compassion didn't erase what she'd done. Grace insecurity explains your behavior. It doesn't excuse it. I know. You didn't just lie to Barbara. You used me to support the lie. She nodded. You made decisions about my home. You expected me to sacrifice my plans. And when I said no, you brought everyone there because you believed I'd be too embarrassed to stand my ground. I know. Her voice was barely audible. I looked at the woman sitting across from me and saw both versions of my daughter at once. The frightened adult, desperate for approval, and the little girl I had spent my life protecting. Maybe that was why what I said next hurt both of us. You didn't borrow my cottage, Grace. She looked at me. You borrowed my life and called it yours. She covered her mouth. I had tears in my eyes now, too. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Grace asked the question I had been expecting. What happens now? I don't know. Are you going to forgive me? I love you. That's not what I asked. No. She looked frightened. I reached across the table and touched her hand. I probably will forgive you, but forgiveness isn't pretending this didn't teach me something. What did it teach you? That I've spent too much time assuming you understood where my life ends and yours begins. She pulled her hand back slowly. Are you changing your will? I hadn't mentioned my will. Not once. The question hung between us. And strangely hearing her ask it made my next decision clearer. I haven't decided. Grace stared at me. For the first time, the possibility that the cottage might not automatically become hers seemed real. She left 20 minutes later. There was no shouting, no slammed door. That somehow made it sadder. After she left, I sat alone at the kitchen table. Then I went upstairs and opened the small fireproof box where I kept my important documents. Inside was the estate plan Thomas and I had created years ago. I read it carefully. Then I found the business card of the attorney who had helped update it after Thomas died. The next morning I called his office. Not because I wanted to punish Grace. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I had finally understood something. If I didn't decide what my life and my property meant while I was still here, other people would continue deciding for me. The receptionist offered me an appointment the following Tuesday. I took it. And when I walked into that lawyer's office, I carried an envelope containing the future Grace had always assumed was already hers. The envelope I carried into my lawyer's office contained a copy of the estate plan Thomas and I had signed years earlier. I had read it twice the night before. Then I had cried. Not because there was anything surprising in it, because there wasn't. Everything was exactly as I remembered. After Thomas died, our financial accounts, our Richmond home, and the beach cottage became mine. When I died, almost everything would pass to Grace. At the time, that had seemed natural. She was our only child. Thomas and I had never discussed another possibility. But we had written that plan when Grace was younger, when Thomas was alive, and when I still thought inheritance was simply the final chapter of parenting. Now I wasn't so sure. My attorney, Robert Hayes, had worked with Thomas and me for nearly 20 years. He was in his early 60s, soft-spoken, careful, and completely unimpressed by family drama. That was exactly what I needed. He greeted me in the lobby. Odessa, it's good to see you. You too, Robert. Once we were seated in his office, he looked at the envelope in my hands. I'm guessing this isn't a social visit. No. I handed him the documents. I want to review my estate plan. Of course. He didn't ask why immediately. He read. I watched his eyes move across pages that represented decades of my life reduced to legal language. Finally, he removed his glasses. What are you thinking? I don't know yet. That's a perfectly acceptable place to start. I appreciated that. I told him what had happened. Not every argument, not every painful sentence, just the facts. Grace had promised the cottage to her in-laws. She had done it without permission. She had allowed them to believe for years that the cottage would eventually be hers. Michael had apparently made the same assumption. They had discussed future renovations. And when I refused to surrender the cottage, Grace had brought the entire Bennett family there anyway, expecting social pressure to force me to change my mind. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked one question. Are you angry? Yes. Then I wouldn't recommend changing your estate plan today. That surprised me. I thought you'd tell me it was my decision. It is. He leaned back. But decisions made to punish someone often look different after the anger passes. I'm not trying to punish Grace. I believe you. Then why wait? Because I want you to be able to say exactly what you're trying to accomplish. I looked down at my hands. That was harder. If I wasn't trying to punish Grace, what was I doing? Protecting myself. Protecting the cottage. Teaching her a lesson. All of those answers sounded incomplete. I want the cottage to mean something, I finally said. Robert waited. It already does, I continued. Thomas and I worked for it. Grace grew up spending summers there. After Thomas died, it helped me learn how to live without him. Then what's changed? I've changed. I thought about Rebecca, about the scholarship idea, about the 5 of us sitting around the cottage table. I used to think the house was valuable because of what happened there in the past. And now I think maybe it can be valuable because of what happens there in the future. Robert nodded slowly. Tell me more. So I told him about the bridge club rental. I told him about Rebecca returning to community college in her 50s. I told him about the women I'd begun learning about through the college. Women who had spent decades raising children. Women leaving marriages. Women widowed unexpectedly. Women caring for elderly parents until they themselves reached retirement age. Women who wanted to begin again but couldn't afford tuition, certification fees, books, uniforms, or equipment. I don't have enough money to create some enormous foundation, I said. You don't need enormous money to do something useful. That's what Thomas would have said. Robert smiled. I remember Thomas. So do I. My voice cracked slightly. I looked toward the window until I had myself under control. What if the cottage helped fund something after I'm gone? Robert leaned forward. Now we're talking about a goal instead of a reaction. That sentence mattered. A goal instead of a reaction. Could I do that? There are several ways. He explained charitable trusts, property arrangements, maintenance costs, rental income, and the importance of making sure whatever I created could realistically support itself. I asked questions, a lot of questions. The office manager in me returned. What happens if maintenance becomes too expensive? What about taxes? Who oversees rentals? Can the property eventually be sold if keeping it no longer makes financial sense? Robert answered each one. The more we talked, the clearer my thinking became. I didn't want the cottage turned into a monument to me or Thomas. I wanted it used. While I was alive, it would remain mine. I would still spend summers there. I would invite friends. Grace could still visit if our relationship healed. I wasn't giving away my present. But after my death, I wanted the property placed into a charitable structure designed to support educational opportunities for women over 50, returning to school or vocational training. If rental income could help fund scholarships, wonderful. If someday the cottage needed to be sold, the proceeds could continue the same mission. Robert made notes. This will require more planning than changing a name on a beneficiary form. I'm not in a hurry. Good. I want it done correctly. We can do that. Then I said something important. I don't want to disinherit Grace. Robert looked up. I didn't assume you did. She is still my daughter. Of course. My financial accounts, investments, other property. I still want her provided for. Then we structure it that way. I don't want this to look like revenge. Odessa, the best protection against that is clarity. He tapped his pen against the legal pad. Your estate plan should reflect your values, not your anger. My values. That was what I had almost forgotten. For weeks, the cottage had been discussed as if it were a prize. Who deserved it? Who would inherit it? Who had priority? But Thomas and I had never built our life around prizes. We built it around usefulness. By the time I left Robert's office, nothing had been signed. But the direction was clear. The cottage would have a different future. I drove home feeling unexpectedly peaceful. That peace lasted until the following afternoon. Grace called. Did you meet with a lawyer? I froze. Who told you? Michael saw Robert downtown yesterday. He mentioned seeing you. I almost laughed at the coincidence. Yes. Grace went quiet. About your will. Among other things. Are you cutting me out? The speed of the question hurt. Grace. Just tell me. No. No, you're not, or no, you won't tell me. I'm not cutting you out. I heard her exhale. Then I added, but I'm reconsidering what happens to the cottage. Silence. What does that mean? It means exactly what I said. Because of the reunion. No. Of course it is. The reunion forced me to think about something I should have thought about years ago. What I actually want. Her voice hardened. So you're giving it to someone else? I'm considering placing it into a charitable trust after I die. She said nothing. The idea is to use the cottage or its value to support scholarships for women over 50 returning to education or career training. Grace gave a stunned little laugh. You're serious? Very. You're giving Dad's cottage away. The phrase irritated me instantly. Dad's cottage. You know what I mean. No, I don't. Our family cottage. It was your father's and mine. Now it's mine. That's so cold. Ownership isn't cold. You're doing this because you're angry with me. No. Then why now? Because now I understand what happens when nobody says clearly what belongs to whom. Grace began crying. So that's my punishment. This isn't punishment. How could it not be? I took a breath. Because I am not taking anything away from you. You are. No, Grace. Mom, I grew up there. So did many of your happiest memories. Those remain yours. I always thought. She stopped. I know what you thought. Then how can you do this? I closed my eyes. Because I knew the sentence I needed to say. And I knew she wouldn't like it. I'm not taking away something that belongs to you, Grace. I'm deciding what happens to something that belongs to me. She became completely silent. I continued more gently. You will still inherit from me. This isn't about leaving you with nothing. That's not the point. Then what is? It's Dad. There was real pain in her voice now. The cottage is part of him. That reached me. I know. Don't I get to keep something? Grace, your father is not inside the deed. She started crying harder. I softened my voice. You have his photographs, his letters, his watch, his stories. You have 39 years of being his daughter. But the cottage was something your father and I built together, and if it helps women build new lives after I'm gone, I think he'd be proud of that. Grace didn't answer. I didn't ask her to agree. Not yet. Before hanging up, I said, I love you. She whispered, I love you too. Then the line went dead. I sat alone for a long time. Part of me wondered whether I had just created a wound that would never fully heal. But another part of me felt something I hadn't felt during the entire conflict. Freedom. For the first time, I wasn't making a decision based on what Grace expected from me. I was making one based on what I believed mattered. Over the following weeks, Robert began preparing the documents. The scholarship idea moved forward too. And then Rebecca called me one afternoon with news. The community college had identified a woman who might qualify for our first small award. Her name was Linda Morgan. She was 57 years old. She had spent most of her adult life taking care of other people. Now, for the first time in decades, she was trying to build something for herself. When Rebecca told me her story, I had no idea Grace would soon hear it too. And that hearing Linda speak would change something in my daughter that no argument between us ever could. I met Linda Morgan on a Saturday afternoon in a small meeting room at the community college. There were no reporters, no banners, no oversized check for photographs. That was intentional. The Bridge Club had agreed from the beginning that if our little scholarship project became more about us than the women it was meant to help, we had missed the point. Helen brought cookies. Nancy brought twice as many cookies because she didn't trust Helen's baking. Judith brought flowers. Rebecca brought Linda. I brought the first scholarship check. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to cover part of Linda's tuition textbooks, required scrubs, and several fees for the medical assistant program she had been accepted into. When Linda entered the room, I knew immediately she was nervous. She was 57 with shoulder-length brown hair threaded with gray, and a face that seemed younger whenever she smiled. She wore a navy blouse and simple black pants. Rebecca introduced us. Linda, this is Odessa Franklin. Linda took my hand with both of hers. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to. I do. Her eyes filled almost immediately. That made mine do the same. I laughed softly. If we both start crying before we sit down, this is going to be a very long afternoon. She laughed too. That helped. We gathered around a rectangular table. Someone from the college's adult education office joined us, but the gathering was otherwise simple. Coffee, cookies, flowers. 5 older women who had played enough bridge together to insult each other's card skills without damaging the friendship. And one woman who was trying to begin again at 57. After we talked for a while, I asked Linda what had brought her back to school. She looked down at her hands. I don't know where to start. Wherever you want. She took a breath. I got married at 21. Nobody interrupted. My first daughter was born when I was 23. My second came 3 years later. I worked here and there, mostly part-time, but somebody always needed me at home. She smiled faintly. You know how that happens. Every woman at the table knew. My husband worked long hours. I handled the children, the house appointments, school, everything. Then Linda's mother became ill. For 6 years, I helped take care of her. After her mother died, Linda's father needed help. Then her husband developed health problems. By the time I looked up, she said, I was 55 years old. She laughed, but there was sadness underneath it. I remember thinking, how did that happen? I was 35 5 minutes ago. Nancy nodded. That's exactly how they get you. Everyone laughed. Linda relaxed a little. Then she continued. Her daughters were grown. Her husband had recovered enough to return to part-time work. For the first time in decades, nobody needed Linda every hour of the day. And I didn't know who I was. That sentence silenced the room. I knew who I was to everybody else, she said. Mom, wife, daughter, caregiver. The woman who remembers where the insurance papers are. Helen smiled. We all need that woman. Linda nodded. But when I asked myself what I wanted, I couldn't answer. One afternoon, she'd gone with her husband to a medical appointment. A medical assistant, there had been close to her age. They started talking. The woman told Linda she'd completed her training at 52. I went home and looked up the program that night. Linda applied. She was accepted. Then came the costs: tuition, books, uniforms, certification fees, transportation. I almost talked myself out of it. Rebecca leaned toward her. Why? Linda looked embarrassed. Because spending money on myself felt selfish. I felt those words in my chest. How many women had been taught that we could spend money on children, on husbands, on aging parents, on groceries, on birthday gifts, on everyone else's emergencies. But when the money was for our own future, Suddenly, we needed permission. Linda continued. I kept thinking I'm 57. How many working years do I even have left? She paused. Then one night I told my daughter I was thinking about quitting before classes even started. What did she say? I asked. Linda smiled. She said, Mom, you're going to be 60 someday whether you go to school or not. Nancy slapped the table. I like her. We laughed again. Then Linda's eyes moved toward the scholarship check in front of me. When the college called and told me about this, I sat in my car and cried. I swallowed. I hope they were good tears. They were. She looked at each of us. I thought my useful years were behind me. The room became completely still. That sentence landed somewhere deep inside me. My useful years. I thought about Thomas, about retirement, about the way people sometimes spoke to older women as though we had already moved from participants in life to observers of it. I thought about Grace treating my cottage as something waiting for its next owner. And suddenly I understood exactly why this scholarship mattered. Not because we were rescuing Linda. She didn't need rescuing. She needed someone to stop telling her directly or indirectly that it was too late. It's not over, I said. Linda looked at me. What's not? Your useful years. My voice shook. Not even close. Her eyes filled again. So did mine. Helen reached for a tissue. Nancy said, Now everybody's crying and I specifically came for cookies. That saved us. We laughed through the tears. I handed Linda the check. There was no ceremony. Just two women standing beside a folding table. When she hugged me, she whispered, Thank you for believing there's still time. I whispered back, Thank you for reminding me. I didn't notice Grace standing in the doorway. Rebecca did. Her expression shifted slightly and I followed her gaze. My daughter stood near the back of the room. She was alone. No Michael. No Barbara. She looked uncertain whether she should come inside. I hadn't invited her. At least I didn't think I had. Grace. Everyone turned. Grace's cheeks reddened. Hi, I stood. What are you doing here? She held up her phone. Rebecca sent me the information. I looked at Rebecca. She gave me an apologetic expression. I thought she should see it. For a moment I was irritated. Then I looked at Grace again. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She looked shaken. Can I stay? She asked. That question mattered. Can I not? I'm coming in. Not, you need to let me. A question. Yes, I said. Grace sat in the back. Linda didn't know anything about our family conflict. I was grateful for that. She continued talking about the program, her fears, and what she hoped to do after certification. Grace listened. Really listened. When Linda talked about spending decades taking care of other people, Grace's eyes moved toward me. I pretended not to notice. When Linda said she'd felt guilty spending money on herself, Grace looked down. And when Linda repeated that she had believed her useful years were behind her, I saw my daughter wipe away a tear. Afterward, everyone mingled. Grace stayed near the wall. Eventually, Linda approached her. You must be Odessa's daughter. Grace smiled faintly. Yes. Your mother is something special. Grace looked at me. I know. There was something different in the way she said it. Linda continued. She told me the scholarship started with some rental money from her beach cottage. Grace's expression changed. She did. Apparently these ladies rented it for 3 weeks. Linda laughed. Best rent money anybody ever spent. Helen raised her coffee cup. I agree. Grace looked around the room. At Helen, Nancy, Judith, Rebecca, Linda, then at me. For weeks she had described the bridge club as though they were merely 4 women playing cards. People who could be moved. People whose plans mattered less. Now she was looking at the same women differently. Rebecca had rebuilt her career after 50. Judith had survived widowhood. Helen had dragged me out of isolation after Thomas died. Nancy had brought laughter into rooms that desperately needed it. And Linda was about to begin training for a new career at 57. The cottage money hadn't disappeared into a vacation. It had moved through friendship and become opportunity. Grace walked toward me after the others began cleaning up. I didn't know. About Linda. About any of this. I told you about the scholarship. I heard the word scholarship. She looked ashamed. I don't think I listened. I didn't answer. She looked toward Linda, who was talking with Rebecca. Is this what you want the trust to do? Yes. Help women like her. Women who need a second beginning. Grace nodded slowly. Dad would have liked that. The words surprised me. I think so too, she looked at me. I still hate the idea of losing the cottage. I appreciated the honesty. I know. But I think I finally understand that you're not throwing it away. No. You're making it do something. I smiled. Your father always liked useful things. Grace laughed softly. He hated decorative towels. He said towels that couldn't dry your hands were dishonest. For the first time in weeks, we shared a memory without fighting over who owned it. Grace wiped another tear. Then she said goodbye. She didn't ask me to change the trust. She didn't ask what she would inherit instead. She simply hugged me. It was brief, careful, but real. 2 nights later, she called. Mom, can I come over tomorrow? What for? There was a pause. To apologize. I closed my eyes. We had already exchanged apologies in fragments, but something in her voice told me this would be different. Come around 4. I'll be there. And Grace? Yes. Come alone. I will. The next afternoon, when I opened my front door, my daughter was standing there with nothing in her hands. No paperwork, no argument, no request. And for the first time since this began, I realized she wasn't coming to ask me for anything. Grace stood on my porch with nothing in her hands. No purse except the small one hanging from her shoulder. No papers. No flowers. No peace offering. For some reason, that mattered to me. When people know they've hurt you, they sometimes arrive carrying something because objects are easier than words. Grace had only brought herself. Come in, I said. Thanks, Mom. I led her into the living room. Coffee? No. Tea? She almost smiled. I'm okay. I sat in my usual chair. Grace sat on the sofa across from me, in almost the same place Michael had occupied when he came to negotiate the cottage. The memory wasn't lost on me. For several seconds, Grace said nothing. I didn't help her. If she had come to apologize, I needed the words to belong to her. Finally, she took a breath. I've been thinking about Linda. I nodded. And Rebecca. Another pause. And you. I waited. Grace looked down at her hands. I owe you an apology that doesn't have a but attached to it. That got my attention. She looked at me. I've apologized before, but every time I did, I followed it with an explanation. I was embarrassed, but Barbara made me feel insecure, but everyone had already made plans, but I thought you'd say yes. Her voice shook. I kept explaining myself because I wanted you to forgive me without making me fully admit what I did. I felt something in my chest loosen. Not disappear, just loosen. Grace continued. So I'm not going to do that today. She folded her hands tightly. I lied. The words sat between us. I promised something that wasn't mine. Then I lied to you about how much I'd promised. I lied to Barbara by letting her believe I'd gotten permission. I let Michael help me keep the lie going. She swallowed. And when you said no, I didn't respect it. My eyes began to burn. Grace's did too. I thought if I brought everybody to the cottage, you wouldn't be able to turn us away. That was the part that hurt the most. I know. No, Grace. I need you to understand why. She nodded. I leaned forward. You used what you knew about me against me. Her face crumpled. You knew I'd see those children. You knew I'd see luggage and people who had driven for hours. You knew I'd feel guilty. I know. You counted on my kindness becoming pressure. A tear slid down her cheek. Yes. The honesty hurt. But strangely, it also healed something. For weeks, Grace had minimized. Now she wasn't. I'm sorry, she whispered. I looked toward the window. Outside, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the lawn. I've spent my whole life wanting to make things easier for you. I know. When you were little, that's what being your mother meant. If you fell, I picked you up. If you were scared, I stayed beside you. My voice softened. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that raising an adult daughter can't mean removing every consequence from her life. Grace wiped her face. You didn't do anything wrong. Oh, I made mistakes. Not like mine. This isn't a competition. That made her laugh through her tears. For a moment, she looked 15 again. Then she grew serious. There's something else I need to tell you. I waited. I was ashamed. I felt my body tense. Of me. Grace closed her eyes. That's what I've been trying not to admit. The answer hurt even though I already knew it. She continued quickly. Not because you did anything wrong. Not because Dad did. Then why? Because I thought ordinary meant less. The room went very quiet. Grace stared at the floor. When I married Michael, I felt like everybody in his family had a story that sounded impressive. Charles owned dealerships. Barbara knew people with vacation homes and club memberships. Michael worked in real estate and talked about million-dollar properties. And your parents? You worked in an insurance office. Dad fixed machinery. I nodded. That's what we did. I know, Grace started crying again. I was ashamed of the wrong person. I frowned. What do you mean? I kept worrying that the Bennetts would be ashamed of me. She looked directly at me. But I was the one becoming ashamed of you. The words cut deeply. Grace didn't look away. I took everything you and Dad worked for and dressed it up because I thought the truth wasn't impressive enough. I couldn't speak. You saved for years to buy that cottage. Dad worked overtime. You kept a job, raised me, paid bills, and somehow made our childhood feel easy, even when it wasn't. She shook her head. And instead of being proud of that, I turned Dad into some operations executive and you into an insurance manager because I wanted your jobs to sound better. A tear escaped my eye. Grace's voice broke. I'm so sorry. I wiped my cheek. Your father was proud of his work. I know. He could fix almost anything. I know. And I was proud of mine. You should have been. I was. That was the difference. Thomas and I had never needed our lives to sound impressive. Grace had needed them to sound impressive for us. I wish you'd understood that earlier, I said. So do I. She took a breath. At Linda's scholarship meeting, I kept looking around that room. At what? At all of you. She smiled faintly. Helen, Nancy, Judith, Rebecca. Women I'd reduced to your bridge club. I said nothing. Rebecca went back to school after 50. Linda is starting over at 57. Helen helped you after Dad died. Those women aren't sitting around waiting to become old. Despite myself, I smiled. Don't say that to Nancy. She'll make it a t-shirt. Grace laughed. Then she became serious again. I realized something. What? I've been treating your life like it's already finished. The sentence landed hard. She continued. Not consciously. I didn't think Mom's old so her life doesn't matter. But every time I talked about what I'd inherit, every time Michael and I discussed the cottage someday, every time I assumed your plans could move, because mine mattered more. Her voice faded. I was acting like your future was smaller than mine. I had no words. That was exactly what I had felt, but hadn't known how to name. Grace leaned toward me. You're 68. You're not gone. Definitely not. You're starting a scholarship. Trying to. You're traveling with friends. You're changing your estate plan. You're building something. She wiped her eyes. And I was standing there asking when I got the house. I reached across the space between us. This time Grace took my hand. I'm sorry, Mom. I squeezed her fingers. I believe you. Her eyes widened slightly. It was the first time I had said that. Not I love you. Not we'll work through it. I believe you. She cried harder. So did I. After a while, Grace asked, Have you finalized the trust? Robert is still working on it. She nodded. Then she said something I had been waiting to hear without realizing it. I don't want you to change it for me. I studied her face. You don't know. Grace, if you're saying that because you think it's what I want to hear, I'm not. She took a breath. I still love that cottage. I know. I still wish it could stay exactly the way it was forever. So do I sometimes. But it can't. That was true about more than houses. Grace continued. If helping women like Linda is what you want it to do after you're gone, then that's what it should do. I felt another tear slide down my cheek. And if someday the trust has to sell it, Grace swallowed. I'll hate that. I smiled sadly. Me too. But I understand. That was enough. Not approval. Understanding. We sat together for another hour. We talked about Thomas. We talked about the cottage. We even talked about Barbara. Grace admitted she had spent years interpreting every comment Barbara made as judgment. Has she ever actually told you that you weren't good enough? I asked again. No. Then perhaps you owe her a more honest relationship too. Grace nodded. I think I do. What about Michael? He apologized. To you. To me. He said he shouldn't have treated your future property like part of our financial plan. That phrase made me wince. Our financial plan? Grace gave an embarrassed smile. Exactly. At least he's honest. He wants to apologize to you too. When he's ready. He is. Then when I'm ready. Grace nodded. No argument. Another small change. As evening settled outside, she stood to leave. At the door, I hugged her. Not carefully this time. I held my daughter the way I had when she was young. She rested her head against my shoulder. I love you, Mom. I love you too. Forgiveness didn't arrive like a door opening. It came like sunlight moving slowly across a room. The hurt was still there. Trust would take time. But for the first time, neither of us was demanding that the other pretend nothing had happened. Grace stepped onto the porch. Then she turned. Mom, yes. If I ever want to use the cottage again. I raised an eyebrow. She smiled. I ask. That's generally how it works. And if you say no, you survive. Grace laughed. I think I'm finally learning that. I watched her drive away. I didn't know then exactly what our relationship would look like a year later. I didn't know whether Barbara and I would ever be comfortable around each other again. I didn't know how many women the scholarship would eventually help. But I knew something had changed. Grace had come to my house asking for nothing, and she had left without the cottage, without a promise of inheritance, and without any guarantee that everything would return to the way it had been. Yet somehow I felt closer to her than I had before the entire mess began. Because for the first time in years, my daughter wasn't looking at me as the keeper of something she would eventually receive. She was looking at me as a woman who still had a life of her own. And 1 year later, at the same little cottage that had nearly torn us apart, Grace would prove she had finally learned the difference. 1 year later, I stood on the porch of the cottage, watching 3 cars turn into the driveway. For half a second, the sight took me back to the afternoon everything had exploded. 3 SUVs, suitcases, Barbara climbing my porch steps, Grace asking me not to embarrass her. My stomach tightened from memory, before my mind reminded me that this time was different. Very different. Helen came through the screen door carrying lemonade. They're here. They're here. Should I hide the rental agreement? I laughed. Behave yourself. I am behaving. You've never behaved a day in your life. That's why you keep me around. The first car stopped. Grace stepped out. She looked toward the porch and waved. Michael climbed out behind her. Then Barbara and Charles arrived in the second car. The third belonged to Rebecca, who had brought Linda Morgan and Linda's husband. Nobody had come expecting a bedroom. Nobody had brought 3 weeks of luggage. And most importantly, nobody had come without asking. They were here for the first annual Franklin Second Beginning Scholarship Luncheon. The name hadn't been my idea. I had argued against it. Rebecca had ignored me. Over the previous year, our little scholarship project had grown. Not dramatically. We weren't suddenly a national charity. There were no television interviews or wealthy donors writing 6-figure checks. It grew the way meaningful things often do, slowly. One person told another. The community college helped us establish proper procedures. Robert completed the legal work for the future charitable trust connected to the cottage. Several women from our bridge circle contributed. A local business donated money for textbooks, and Linda had completed her medical assistant program. At 58 years old, she had started working at a family practice outside Richmond. The first time she sent me a photograph of herself wearing scrubs and an employee badge, I cried so hard I had to clean my glasses twice. That photograph was now framed inside the cottage. Grace noticed it almost immediately. "Is that Linda?" "It is." She stepped closer. Linda came in behind her and laughed. I looked terrified. "You were terrified," Rebecca said. "I was trying not to show it." "You failed." Everyone laughed. I watched Grace turn toward Linda. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Linda smiled. "And thank your mother. She can be dangerously persuasive." Grace looked at me. "I've noticed." There was affection in her voice. A year earlier, that sentence might have carried resentment. Now it didn't. Healing, I had learned, wasn't forgetting what happened. It was remembering without needing the memory to keep hurting. Michael approached me while the others carried food toward the kitchen. "Odessa." "Michael." He looked nervous. That pleased me more than it should have. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course." We stepped toward the far end of the porch. He put his hands into his pockets. "I've wanted to say this for a while." I waited. "I'm sorry." I said nothing. He continued. "For the way I handled everything last year, especially coming to your house with those rental listings." "You did look very prepared." He smiled awkwardly. "I thought if I could make the numbers work, the problem would disappear." "You're in real estate." "Occupational hazard." "Apparently." His expression became serious. "I treated your cottage like an asset in a transaction." "Yes. And worse, I treated your future like something Grace and I could plan around." I appreciated that he didn't soften it. "I shouldn't have." "No. I understand that now." "Good." He hesitated. "And the hotel invoice was ridiculous." I raised an eyebrow. "Only the invoice." He laughed. "All right. Most of it was ridiculous." I held out my hand. Michael looked at it. Then he ignored it and hugged me. I was surprised, but I hugged him back. "Thank you," I said. "No, thank you for eventually speaking to me again. Don't make me regret it." "I won't." Later, Barbara found me in the kitchen. For months after the reunion, our relationship had remained polite but distant. That was fine with me. Not every conflict needed to end with two people becoming best friends. Sometimes peace was. She stood beside me while I arranged sandwiches. "Odessa." "Yes. I owe you an apology too." I looked at her. She sighed. "I should never have asked you to cancel your friend's plans." "No, you shouldn't have." "And that Facebook post. Our family's private cottage." Barbara covered her face briefly. "I was hoping you'd forgotten the exact wording." "Not a chance," she laughed. Then her expression softened. Grace told me what she had been doing. I stopped arranging sandwiches. "How much enough?" Barbara looked embarrassed. The way she'd exaggerated things. The way she thought I expected her to be wealthier or more impressive than she was. I waited. I wish she'd told me sooner. "What would you have said?" Barbara thought about it. "That Charles's first dealership nearly failed." I blinked. "What?" "We spent our first years of marriage counting every dollar," she smiled. "I used coupons too." I laughed. "Don't tell Grace. You'll destroy 12 years of mythology." "I already told her." "How did she take it?" "She cried." That sounded like Grace. Barbara looked toward the living room where my daughter was talking with Linda. "I suppose I contributed to it." "How?" "I like nice things." "There's nothing wrong with that." "No. But sometimes I talk about them too much." That was the closest Barbara Bennett would ever come to confessing a character flaw. I respected the effort. "I never thought Grace wasn't good enough for Michael," she said. "I know. She knows now. That's what matters." Around noon, we carried everything outside. There were 11 of us around two tables pushed together on the porch. My bridge club, Linda and her husband, Grace and Michael, Barbara and Charles, and me. Before we ate, Rebecca tapped her glass. "Odessa should say something." "No." "Yes." "Absolutely not." Nancy pointed at me. "You created the scholarship. We created it." Fine. Then all 5 of us should speak. That sounded worse. Everyone laughed. Eventually I stood. I looked around the table. Then I looked toward the ocean. I used to think this cottage was where I kept my memories. Grace watched me. For years, that was enough. Thomas and I bought it together. We raised Grace here during summers. After he died, I thought preserving the cottage exactly as it had been was a way of preserving him. My voice tightened. But houses aren't memories. I looked at Grace. People are. Her eyes filled. The best thing we can do with what we have isn't always to keep it. Sometimes it's to use it. I turned toward Linda. This year the scholarship helped 1 woman. Linda smiled. Next year we hope it helps 2. Helen raised her glass. 3. Let's pay the bills first. Everyone laughed. I continued. The point isn't the number. The point is that beginning again should never have an age limit. Linda wiped her eyes. So did Grace. We ate, we laughed. Nancy cheated at bridge afterward and denied it with impressive confidence. Barbara tried to learn the game and discovered she hated losing. Charles fell asleep in a porch chair. Michael helped Linda's husband repair a loose cabinet hinge, and Grace washed dishes beside me. At one point, she looked through the window toward the yard. Mom? Can I ask you something? I smiled. You just did. She rolled her eyes. Some things never changed. Can Michael and I use the cottage for a weekend in October? I looked at her. She waited. No assumption, no pressure, no explanation about why she deserved it. Just a question. Which weekend? She told me. I thought about my calendar. That should be fine, Grace smiled. Thank you. Then she added, if your plans change, that's okay. That sentence meant more to me than she knew. I touched her cheek. I think October will work. That evening after everyone left, I stayed on the porch alone. The sunset turned the sky orange and pink. I thought about Thomas, about the years we'd worked for this place, about the argument that almost made me resent it, about Grace, about Linda, about everything that had changed. The cottage still belonged to me. Someday it would belong to a purpose. But tonight it belonged to the moment. And so did I. For most of my life, I believed being a good mother meant leaving something behind for my child. Money, property, security, something tangible that proved I had taken care of her. Now I understood there was something more important I could leave Grace. The knowledge that love does not require surrender. That generosity without boundaries becomes expectation. That an inheritance is a gift, not a debt owed by the living to the next generation. And that a woman does not become less entitled to her own future simply because her children have started imagining theirs. Grace nearly lost sight of me while waiting to inherit something from me. In the end, she received something better. She learned to see me again. Not as a widow, not as an aging mother, not as the current owner of her future beach cottage, as Odessa Franklin, a woman still living her own life.